Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. Now, I've posted a number of presentations that explain why the American economy boomed. But there was always another side to the economy, a worrying side, and that's what this presentation is going to focus on. First, some key questions. Why did agriculture not share in the prosperity? Why did some industries prosper while others didn't? Why was unemployment persistently edging on the high side? Why didn't more Americans benefit from the boom? Why didn't Native Americans, African Americans, and immigrants benefit? If you can answer these questions and describe what life was like for those struggling, you'll be well prepared for the exam. I never lose sight of the fact that half of Americans lived in rural areas, so it was really important. Some 30 million Americans earned a living through farming, whether as farmers, sharecroppers, or agricultural labourers, or else selling machinery or providing services to farmers. But agriculture was struggling, and you know why, so I won't go into any kind of detail. But encouraged to maximise their output during World War I, American farmers were overproducing, and were now producing more food than America needed, at the same time as they faced competition from other countries. The result was that prices dropped drastically. So, as the 1920s progressed, a vicious circle or cycle kicked in. Prices dropped, so income dropped, and farmers found it difficult to meet their mortgage payments or pay their loans. The loans had been taken out to extend their farms or to buy modern machinery when demand was high. Farm bankruptcies increased fivefold from the previous 2 decades, and the number of farms dropped for the first time in America's history. What's more, mechanization had already reduced the number of farm labourers needed. In total, something like 6 million people left farming. Those that remained barely scraped a living, and the wider rural economy was of course affected. For example, hundreds of rural banks closed. But it wasn't just overproduction in farming that was worrying. Some of the base industries providing raw materials, like coal, copper and tin, overproduced too. They also found themselves competing against newer products. So prices dropped, and wages too. Too much coal was being produced, and the market for coal was in any case shrinking as oil, gas and electricity were increasingly used as alternatives. Even where coal was being used to generate electricity, new efficient technology meant electricity producers did not use anything like as much coal as they had before. If wages weren't cut, it could be worse. Mines closed down altogether. And where wages were cut, so too were safety measures, and men were obliged to work longer hours. The traditional cotton and woolen industries faced competition from new artificial fibres, such as rayon, and textile workers were already amongst the lowest paid. This now meant that there was not even enough for essentials such as food, housing, heating and clothing. The American way simply wasn't working for everyone. Unemployment was never fully tamed, and average earnings increased by only 10% over the whole decade. Another thing, the boom didn't necessarily create more jobs, as electrification and mechanization meant that less labour was needed in many industries. As a result, unemployment averaged at around 5% in the 1920s, in a boom. And of those unemployed, though they included white Americans too, they included bigger proportions of African Americans, Hispanics, and other large minorities. There was also a general downturn in the economy after the war, for with the end of war contracts, firms laid off workers at the very time that 4 million soldiers were being demobbed. The result was a sharp rise in unemployment. What was more, prices had risen sharply during the war, but wages had lagged behind and continued to do so after the war. And in all this, trade unions were weak. Even so, strikes, though they failed in their aims, led to a fear of communism. And America also began to close the door to immigrants. African Americans were discriminated against in the job market. During the war, African Americans, attracted by jobs available in the factories, had moved to the cities in the north. However, so often it would be low-paid work. Many women could only find work as domestic servants, whilst the men would take the most menial jobs. And they would be living in the worst available housing, damp, dirty, overcrowded, and with poor amenities, whether it be shops, public services or schools. And once the war was over, competition for jobs increased, and many whites resented the black newcomers. There were race riots in some 23 cities across America in 1919 as a reaction to discrimination and the levels of poverty in the African American communities. As for Native Americans, where they were confined to reservations, the land was so poor that it was impossible to make a living. Native Americans also suffered from poor education and ill health. The other group that didn't share in the good times were the new immigrants. Often less educated, and in any case struggling to learn their new language, they were obliged to take whatever work they could find. Many found themselves working in construction, their wages kept low by the fact that so many of them were looking for work. The unemployment rate amongst the new immigrants remained high throughout the boom years. The clear fact was that not everyone benefited from the boom. Far from it. The middle class did much better out of the boom than the working class. The middle class were much more likely to buy a car or other consumer goods than even the skilled working class. But the most important fact to note was that in 1928, so at the height of the boom, the number of Americans living below the poverty line, that is, those without the means to provide basic shelter, food or clothing, had actually risen and was at an amazingly high 42% of Americans. And if we add those on, or just below the poverty line, the total was 60%, which for an economy booming on the basis of consumerism would prove to be a major problem. And let me add that with poverty comes poor housing and inadequate food, and with that comes disease and general ill health. And I know the picture I use on this slide is from 1937, but it sums up this presentation so well, so I'm using it. So a lot of useful information for you, a lot for you to think about. There's more in my ebook on Amazon if you want it. But for this presentation, that's me finished. Except, that is, to thank you for listening. Cheers.